Hi everyone, welcome to the time and cause of death tutorial. I've looked through this one a couple of times and there's some really neat stuff in here, so let's get to it. The objective is that you will determine the time and cause of death of a human body by analyzing post-mortem decomposition. Whenever you see M-O-R-T, like mortem or mortis or something like that, it always refers to death. So post means after, so post-mortem means after somebody's dying and they're decomposing. So rigor mortis and lividity are two terms you might hear as a forensic technician, forensic scientist, CSI investigator. They refer to things that happen to a mammalian body, actually in animal bodies. It happens to all kinds of animals after death. And these are two of the obvious ones. And there's actually all kinds of mortis. There's rigor mortis, liver mortis. Gosh, I just had a whole list. There's all kinds. Mortis refers to the what happens to certain parts of the body after death. So rigor mortis occurs to the muscles, and we're going to talk about that. Lividity is something different, and there is a difference in the two, and you need to know what it is. The first one, rigor mortis, is what happens when the muscles in the body start to stiffen after the heart stops beating and the blood stops flowing and the oxygen stops flowing. There's a molecule inside of the blood called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. It's mostly used for energy. Every cell in your body uses this for energy, but it does several other things, and one of them is that it kind of, it says lubricates, and I guess that's, for lack of a better word, what happens. It lubricates the spaces between the muscle fibers. When it starts to break down, then that lubrication stops. So if you were to like touch your hand, like the fat part of your thumb right now, that should be, unless something's really wrong with you, that should be kind of soft and kind of mushy, kind of like you were squeezing I don't know, somebody's thumb, but it should be squishy, right? Well, that's because it's flexible. But after rigor mortis, the ATP starts to break down, and therefore the skeletal muscles, they start to contract, but they also start to harden, and then the joints get calcified very quickly, actually, and they start to harden, and the entire structure, I mean, if you can think about what would happen to your hand after death, it just becomes rigid, okay, or rigor, and that's what rigor mortis means. Mortis means death, and rigor means solid. This is a slow process that can be measured by forensic scientists, and it can help them to determine when somebody died. All right, it lasts about 36 hours, and then the body starts going limp again. So over the first 8 hours, the body begins to stiffen, but it's flexible. Then after that, it becomes completely stiff for the next 4 hours and remains that way for 12 hours. So now we're up to about 24 hours at that point. And sometimes after the first 24 hours, it starts to slowly relax, and the body becomes completely slack after 36 hours. If you're trying to determine the time of death, at what stage of this rigor mortis is going on, you can kind of start to say, well, it's at this stage, so they must have died 16 hours ago, or between 12 and 16 hours ago, or something like that. A couple of things affect it. Sadly, talking about elderly or children, people dying, when they die, rigor mortis actually happens quicker, so you have to take that into account. How did they die? Sometimes diseases can make rigor happen faster or quicker. Violent deaths, you crashed in a vehicle, you fell off a building, that tends to affect the nervous system, so actually rigor mortis can actually set in later and last longer. The state of the muscles, because if you had been exercising right before you died, the rigor mortis happens quicker, but it doesn't last as long. Atmospheric conditions, cold weather slows down rigor mortis, warm weather speeds it up and makes it happen over a shorter period of time. But these are all things that are known. Forensic scientists are aware of these factors, so they can take that into account and still get a fairly accurate guess as to when the body was killed. Another thing that happens after this is called lividity. It's also called liver mortis, right? And it occurs when the blood starts kind of draining down to the bottom of the body. I mean, if you're like laying flat on a slab, okay, and your heart's not beating more, the blood just starts to pool wherever the lowest part of the extremity is. If you're laying on your back, it'll be, on your back. If you're laying on a side, it'll pull down to the bottom of that side. If you're laying face down, it'll do the opposite. Because the blood starts to coagulate a little bit, the skin turns bluish purple in color. It looks kind of like bruising, but that's because the blood's no longer receiving oxygen. It doesn't happen the same way in everybody. Parts of the body have liver mortis a little differently depending on where you're sitting, such as in your butt or in your feet or in your hands. And it may be indication that someone may have moved the body after death. That's one good thing we can tell is if somebody died and they laid on their back for a little while and it started to happen, but then the body was moved and now you see that there's signs that there was liver mortis on their back, but now they're laying on their side. It means that the body's been moved. Certain types of death may affect the body's coloration. For example, if someone's poisoned, they typically turn a little bit more cherry red than bluish purple, so you can tell that lividity still happens the same way, but instead of being kind of a bluish purple, it's a little more of a cherry red. Cool, huh? It's a little bit quicker than rigor mortis. It takes place it takes about the same time as rigor mortis, but it has shorter phases. Early signs starts within the first 1 or 2 hours, and then between 2 and 5 hours, it starts to appear as blotchy, purplish on the skin, and then after a while, after that time, after about 5 hours, it becomes totally pronounced, and then they start to turn white at certain parts of your skin. It remains bluish purple even after you apply pressure until after about 10 to 12 hours. After 48 hours, the body cools to its like whatever the temperature is outside, and there's no more lividity present. So again, with a timing thing, you can tell when a body dies, or when a person died, how long ago they died, based on what stage of this liver mortis or this lividity that they've taken place in. Combine that with other techniques and you can start to get a pretty accurate idea of when the body died. You see on TV, we found a body, officer such and such. Well, how long ago did they die? Well, lividity, rigor mortis suggests they died 8 hours ago. Well, how do you know that? Because I'm good. Okay, so this is how they do it, and it's real science. It's not just something made up for television. Now, here's another cool thing that I think happens. This is what I thought was pretty cool, and it's kind of weird, but I'm going to put a link into the videos for a body farm video, because body farms are really interesting. But bugs will start to kind of swarm onto the body in various stages, very predictable stages, for hours and hours and hours after the death. And we can, a body that's in a fairly advanced stage, we can't look at things like lividity and rigor mortis. We have to look at other things. If it's been dead for 2 weeks, we have to look at different things to suggest how long the body's been dead for. And of course, the longer it's been dead, the more difficult it is to accurately say. Within the first 48 hours, you can get down to within an hour or two. Within the first week, you can get down to within the morning or the afternoon of a week ago. But if it's been 2 weeks or so, you're down to within a day or two of how accurate you can be. So one of the ways that we do this is by looking at what kind of bugs are starting to attack the body. It's called forensic entomology. Entomology is a study of bugs, and it's been going on since the 13th century in China. I mean, they've been figuring this stuff out for a long time. In 1996, there was an actual board of forensic entomology to recognize it as an established and well-defined science. And so let's talk about what it means to study the bugs on a dead body. After approximately 48 hours, bacteria and fungi start to help to decompose the body even more. You have built in right now, you have things keeping the bacteria and the fungi from eating away at you. It's your immune system. And that actually keeps going for a little while after you die. But after 48 hours, that's long broken down and there's nothing left. And so bacteria start to really take over parts of your body. I don't mean to get too graphic here, but they release gas as they digest your body, and that's how things can get bloated. Fungus can start to grow in places under your fingernails and your eyes and mouth and nose that can be measured as well. And eventually, even like I said, the bugs start to come in there. So we're looking at corpses that are 3 days old or older. We can start actually looking at the forensics of the entomology or the bugs and what they're doing, and it helps us with timing. It's called a successional wave of insects, meaning that there's a predictable wave of the insects that show up first. During the decomposition, it undergoes physical, chemical, and biological changes, and each stage of that decomposition that the body goes through starts to attract different insects. For example, the Calliphoridae, those are the blowflies, and the Sarcophagidae, I think I said that right, these are the flesh flies that get on it within 24 hours. Okay, you've seen flies flying around dead things, right? Well, that's what we're talking about. Within 24 hours, the flies are starting to, try to find ways to get into the flesh to see if there's something they can eat. Later on, you get more. For instance, when it reaches a certain stage called protein fermentation, where the proteins start to break down, it attracts a type of bug from the family Pyophilidae called cheese skippers. Some insects arrive not to feed on the decomposing body, instead they feed on the insects that are eating the body. So you get that like this whole food chain going on here, but again, they are predictable in when the timing is when they show up. To arrive at an accurate time window, a forensic entomologist has to have an understanding of the insects in the region and the other types of organisms in the region, along with the changes in climate. This stuff will happen faster on a warm day than in a cold day. It'll happen faster if it's laying in a field versus if it's laying on a floor. And so scientists have to understand all of this, and then they've learned all of this by watching bodies decompose at body farms, which I'll tell you about in a minute. But they can factor in all of these things, and knowing that based on past evidence, a body laying in a field should have these types of bugs, I don't know, I'm making this up, but 72 hours after it died. And if they go there and they find these bugs on the body, then they go, oh, that's a Pyophilidae, which means it's at least 72 hours old, for example. It's fascinating. It's unbelievable, the stuff we can learn. Okay, the further along we go, we can look at the maggots that start to crawl on the body. Now here we are talking, instead of hours, even though it's 12 to 24 hours, the eggs start to hatch. They start to grow and develop, and these are larvae, and there's a development process. And so we can see it's predictable when the eggs will get laid on the body, and then it's predictable like on an open wound. It's predictable when the eggs get laid, then it's predictable as to when they'll hatch, and it's predictable how they develop. They develop at a fairly standard rate, of course depending on climate and stuff like that, but we can grab a larvae of a maggot that's crawling on a body, and we can see that this is maggots tend to be this, when they have this shell, for example, they're a certain day old, and that helps us to understand when the body died. Again, don't forget that the further away we are from the date of the time of the actual death, the more or the less accurate we can be. So instead of talking about hours, we start talking about days after just not too long. But it's still very helpful that 25 days later, if you find a body out in the woods, you can do a pretty good prediction as to when that body was actually put there and died, or when that body was killed. Again, all of this has to be studied, and entomologists study bugs, and forensic entomologists, like I said, study the bugs that crawl on dead bodies. It's really cool and interesting stuff. When you find a dead body out in the woods, you got to consider some things. What was the weather like? If it's warm, it's going to happen faster. If it's cold, it's going to happen slower. Like I said, was the body on soil? That would make it easier for things like bugs and maggots to get to it. Or was it inside of a house? Then it's going to decompose a little differently because these creatures can't get there as easily. Was the body wrapped in something like clothing or even like a plastic bag? Then it's going to slow down the speed at which these things happen. Again, though, that doesn't mean we can't predict it. We just now have to compare it to what we've seen happen in lab experiments with dead bodies, right? And alternative insects, there may be a different, that one interesting thing is if you find certain types of insects on the body but they're not from there, it could mean that the body was moved, right? Or other insect life that is at the place that's only like local, like there. Think of a bug that we only have in Florida, okay? And so you have to now know how that bug behaves. And then depending on what kind of chemicals are in the body of the deceased, it may slow or change or affect the development of these bugs, and so you have to know that, and you have to know what happens to a dead body. If it was full of, I don't know, morphine or something, then it could slow down how the bugs swarm on it and how the maggots develop. So finally, after a body is found, a medical examiner, who is a type of forensic scientist, can do an autopsy. And autopsies are, again, very interesting. I have never physically seen one. My wife has assisted in autopsies, but I've never seen one physically. In Okeechobee County, we have a medical examiner that's for several counties, and he's housed at the Indian River State College main campus. And if there is a body that requires an autopsy, it gets sent to that building over there to where the autopsies occurred. I have been I've been a jurist on a grand jury that was investigating a homicide, and I listened to the medical examiner give his testimony, and it was really interesting what he talked about. This person was shot with a gun, so he talked about how he could tell an awful lot about things, about how the person was killed, how long it had been dead, by what happened, what he could tell by looking at the body. It was really neat. So when we talk about manner and cause of death, we're looking at a couple of things. There are 5 classifications of the manner of death. Did they die naturally? Lots of people die naturally. I hope to die naturally myself. This could mean they died from a heart attack. They died from poisoning. They died from just being really old, a stroke. They could have died from chronic alcohol abuse or drug abuse, but that is considered a natural death. An accidental death is, when somebody died because they accidentally overdosed. I guess I don't know how that's different than natural death, but okay. I guess that's ruled accidental if it's an overdose. If you chronically abuse alcohol for your whole life and it finally shuts down your liver and die, I guess that's natural. But if you just drink too much or take too much drugs and die, I guess that's accidental. And of course, car accidents. Sadly, the leading cause of death among teenagers in the United States right now is car accidents, 50% of which involve alcohol. And so there's an awful lot of investigation that goes into that. Another type of death is homicide. That's when someone is unlawfully killed. Not that there's a lawful way to kill somebody, but I guess there kind of is. But homicide is when it's done by a person who killed them for whatever reason. When a police officer shoots a suspect on the line of duty, it's considered a homicide but not murder. Does that make any sense? So murder is when you're killing somebody because you hate them or whatever, but homicide is a lot of other reasons, right? So all murders are considered homicides, but not all homicides are considered murders. Okay, that's a slippery slope I don't want to go down, but I'll just tell you know that last part. All murders are considered homicides, but not all homicides are considered murders. But that is a form of death. That's a manner of death. Suicide, same thing. Suicide can be very evident, but a lot of times an autopsy is performed to make sure that there's no foul play, that the medical examiner is very good at looking at a suicide victim to see if there is by any chance they were murdered with an attempt to make it look like a suicide. That's been on thousands of TV shows, and medical examiners are very good at that. And then there's the old undetermined. Sometimes medical examiners get a body that they just cannot determine how it died. And in a lot of cases, that's probably, to me, one of the hardest ones, I would imagine, because then they have to take a lot of measurements and samples and make a lot of notes, because they can't hold the body for forever, but they may be asked later on to discuss this body, and the body's been embalmed or maybe even buried or maybe even cremated, and so they have to take tons of notes. Now they have to do that anyways. They have to take lots of pictures, make lots of observations, take lots of samples. But if it's undetermined and they don't really know what happened, then I would imagine they have to do as much as they can so that in the future somebody else may be able to say, by a different type of examination or by an examination of another body that died similar, they may go, oh, hey, that could explain that death. And that seems like a lot of work. Now, not all people that die get an autopsy. In fact, most people that die do not have an autopsy performed. But sometimes if it's unexpected or otherwise it's just for some reason it's a little hinky, then an autopsy will occur. Now, the manner of death is the method of a victim's death. It includes such things like a gunshot wound or a fractured skull. The mechanism of death is the physiological change in a victim's body that causes it. You didn't die from the gunshot wound, you died from the damage caused by the bullet as it passed through your body. So the mechanism of death explains the damage that happened to the body. For example, you may have been exsanguinated. So if you got cut accidentally or even on purpose in a major artery, you bled out. You've heard of that, I'm sure. Well, your blood comes out of your body very rapidly, and that's called exsanguination. Okay, if you speak Spanish, you'll know that sangre means blood. Well, ex means get out, and then sanguination means to move the blood. So exsanguination means the blood comes out, and you bled to death. You may suffocate, and there's ways to tell if you suffocated. The medical examiner has to determine that by looking outside the body and inside of the body and performing these medical tests. A lot of these tests are chemical. A lot of these involved taking x-rays or other pictures or cutting the body open and looking at certain organs. They can even, the medical examiner will even review the medical records and the psychiatric records to determine something about the person's life before they died. So, if you were a heavy drinker, or if you were a known drug user, or if you were, I don't know, a basketball player or something, football player, then, it would explain things about your body. I mean, if before you died you were a professional football player, then that might explain certain bumps, bruises, old bone breaks, etc., that the medical examiner may find, and that would make it easier for him to then do an examination of the body, because he wouldn't have to try to figure out, my God, why is this guy had like 10 concussions? Oh, because he was a football player. Okay, that makes sense. Both the manner and the mechanisms of death are important to a medical examiner, and they can help convict a perpetrator if it ended up being homicide. The results can also prove that a suspected homicide was indeed accidental instead of on purpose. It can also prove that the person didn't die from homicide, that they died from something else. So, this is the purpose behind an autopsy, and it has to be done. If it's determined that you can't quite tell what was happening, then yeah, you've got to perform an autopsy, and medical examiners are good at that. And we have a very good medical examiner here in Okeechobee County. Okay, if you're listening to this next week, I'm going to visit the CSI techs at our local sheriff's department, and I'm going to interview them and have a long talk with them, and hopefully have them show me some cool stuff. I don't know what they got planned, but they're excited to know that I'm coming. And so I'm going to have a video put together, but they're going to let me ask questions, and I want you to shoot some questions at me that I can ask them. And I told you guys this last week. I don't know if you listened, but if you do, if I use your question, that's going to mean some bonus points for you. So start emailing me some questions. I got about a week. It's I think a week from tomorrow that I go. No, it's a week from tomorrow that I go. So I'm excited about that. So all right, that's it. Good luck with this.